Hello, and welcome to the Sound Health Network's webinar series. I'm Indre Viscontis, your host and moderator for today's event. The Sound Health Network is led by co-directors Julene Johnson and Charles Lim, who also composed our introductory music, and music therapist Sherry Robb and I round out the leadership team. Our mission is to promote research and public awareness about the impact of music on health and wellness. The Sound Health Network is a partnership of the National Endowment for the Arts with the University of California, San Francisco, in collaboration with the National Institutes of Health, the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts, and Renée Fleming. Feel free to introduce yourselves and post questions in the chat. This webinar series features interdisciplinary conversations between researchers and other stakeholders in our community. We aim to represent diverse perspectives and address obstacles that stand in the way of our joint mission. This month, we're focusing on how musical improvisation might be used as a tool to communicate, to heal, or otherwise. Joining me in conversation is multi-Grammy nominee, MacArthur Fellow, Doris Duke Award recipient, violinist, Regina Carter. Welcome, Regina.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
And John Carpente, a licensed music therapist who brings 20 years of experience working with different populations, including autistic people, and who uses improvisation as a technique in his clinical work. He's a professor of music and music therapy at Molloy College, founder and director of the Rebecca Center for Music Therapy, and founding clinical director of the Center for Autism and Child Development. Welcome, John.
Thank you. It's great to be here. It's an honor.
And neuroscientist Psyche Loui, who is mapping out the brain networks involved in making music. A musician herself, she's an associate professor of creativity and creative practice at Northeastern University and director of the Music, Imaging, and Neural Dynamics Lab, the Mind Lab. Welcome, Psyche.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So I'm really excited for this conversation. I have to say I've been waiting for it ever since we first conceived of it. One of the things I love is the fact that we have three very different domains represented, but all of whom use musical improvisation, which is, some would argue, one of the only ways in which we can be spontaneously creative in a brain scanner. It's really hard to be spontaneously creative on demand if you're a writer or an artist in another way, but musical improvisers learn to do it when the time comes, when the moment comes, because of course, when you get on stage and it's your turn, you don't have time to, let the muse come into your brain. So Regina, I wanted to start with you and ask you about, musical improvisation. Tell us how you use it in your work and how did you develop this skill?
When I started playing violin, I started when I was 4. I had been tested when I was 2 and found that I could repeat whatever what I would hear back pretty fast. And the Suzuki Method was being offered in Detroit, where I'm from, for the first time for strings. And the method is you learn to play by ear first. You learn rhythms. They put fun words to rhythms. And so it's the same way we learn to speak at home, by imitating whoever we're hearing as babies. And my teacher at the time, when we would have our group classes on Saturday, sometimes she would start to make up a melody, and when she tapped you on the shoulder, you had to continue that melody until the next person came in. And so it was just a game, like I never thought of it. And then sometimes we would sight read through Baroque quartets, and in Baroque music, improvisation was a part of that music, and it's been an art that's been lost in when classical came through. So I'm more comfortable with improvisation than, say, reading the notes. But I just think starting at that age and learning by ear and learning, it's an oral tradition. So I think it's harder for people when they've trained reading music their whole lives, and then you say improvise, and just that word itself freaks people out.
Yeah, I mean, that's what we see sometimes, when we look at the brains of classically trained musicians who are asked to improvise versus people from, say, like a jazz tradition where, I mean, you're sort of an anomaly in the sense that Suzuki is still, I think, considered like a classical method.
Right.
But, but yeah, we see, big differences in the brain. Psyche, I wonder if you might talk about that a little bit, about sort of this difference between the approach to improvisation and people who are taught right from the beginning that this is the way that they play music versus someone who's used to perfectionism in the classical method and then is asked to just play on the fly.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I have to say, Regina, I really love your Swing States album. I mean, I feel like
Thank you.
as a violinist myself, but also a very classically trained musician, I didn't really start improvising until I started thinking about how our brains learn from the environment all the time, right? And in some ways, what we're doing right now is an act of improvisation, right? We know that we're all speaking English. We know that we'll be answering some questions and having some conversations, but we don't know exactly what's going to come out of anyone's mind or mouth at any one moment. So in some ways, I would say many musical activities in our brain are improvisatory, but there is something about the kind of conventional conservatory-based classical training these days that does emphasize starting with reading, starting with ear training, and starting with some more technically oriented activities. And so in my lab, what we've done for a couple of years now is look at students who were trained with a classical training, conservatory style classical training, as opposed to students who were trained jazz improv style. And so the idea is that the jazz improv students would be more embracing of improvisatory playing, whereas the classical musicians would be more trained from music theoretical perspectives and so on. And so what we did, one of the few studies we did, we had chord progressions. So think of your 1-4-5-1 chord progression, kind of almost like saying, I take my coffee with cream and sugar, right? And then sometimes instead of cream and sugar, we say cream and socks, right? So slightly unexpected. Or sometimes we say cream and NutraSweet, which is like slightly unexpected, but still semantically appropriate. And we scanned the brains using EEG, or electrophysiological methods, to look at moment by moment what jazz musicians' brains were doing when listening to these expected and unexpected chord progressions versus what classical musicians' brains were doing, and versus people with no particular musical training who, other than just being themselves and being in a musical environment. And what we saw was very curious. So we saw all these differences between the different kinds of brains within 1 second of hearing the unexpected chord. And so within about 200 milliseconds after the unexpected chord came up, the jazz musicians were already very sensitive to that unexpectedness. So it's as if the jazz musicians are saying, oh, look, this unexpected thing happened earlier than the other two groups. And then around 600 milliseconds, everybody's brains recognized. They said, oh, this is an unexpected event. But then at around 800 milliseconds, you actually see a reversal where the classical musicians' brains are still quite actively processing that. You would almost call it a mistake or just that unexpectedness, whereas the jazz musicians have actually forgotten, right? They've actually gone back to baseline and are kind of more open to the next thing that comes up. So our interpretation is that maybe what improv training is doing is making you more receptive to new sounds and new ideas so that you can more readily prepare for kind of changing expectations. I mean, and I think that at the core of it, so much of music is about playing with expectations and playing and using your executive functioning skills to stop and start, right? To change and to pay attention to different players, different changes in the environment, and so that you can very rapidly react to them. And maybe that's what this improvisation work gets at, kind of the core of these perceptual processes that give rise to creativity.
Yeah, I wonder what you think about that, Regina, and how that maps onto, your experience say in front of an audience? I mean, I imagine there's a difference between, when you're improvising for an album where you have multiple takes available to you versus where you're in front of an audience that's, potentially paid a lot of money to hear you and like the pressure's on to put on a good show. What do you think about this idea of like, people who are trained as improvisers kind of looking for the novelty or seeing that and then kind of going on to the next thing, versus, but also within this pressured situation of like having to put on a good performance?
Well, that's so amazing about the brain. It's like I want to see my brain when I'm improvising, but
well, we all do. We all love that.
Yes, please, yes.
I think it's interesting because in the studio, when you compare the two, studio to live, in the studio, I feel like there's more pressure because that light, first of all, when the light comes on and it says record, all of a sudden we're like Cindy Brady. You all are probably too young to remember the episode. And anyway, it was you freeze or you want, and then you're in the studio and you know that this record that you're making, this is a statement that's going to be out there forever. And so you want to be perfect and you maybe do all these takes, and usually the takes don't get any better, they get worse. It's better to go with your first. When you're live in front of an audience, and for me when I'm playing with the band, I'm connected with them and it's a shared experience with the audience. So I feel like I can leave my body and connect more with the music and just that with the audience on another kind of level, and which I can't explain, but we go somewhere else.
Do you know that it reminded me of, I don't know if you've seen the Pixar movie Soul, but
Not yet, but
oh, you have to see it because that's exactly how they illustrate this thing. They have, it's about a jazz musician and he literally goes to another place when he's in the zone, when he's flowing, when he's improvising. But I wonder if you could just describe that a little bit more for us. When you say you leave your body, does that mean that you like what you're paying attention to, what you're sensitive to shifts? Is it like the time expands or retracts, or sort of what can you tell us a little bit more about what that's like?
Yeah, I would say it's it's almost like when you go, if you daydream or when you sleep and you don't remember your dreams, but it's like a very peaceful, if you have a peaceful sleep, you're in this state. And daydreaming, I was told you are thinking about something, you just don't know that you're thinking about it. But that space where people go, where you're very calm, there's nothing there, you're just in this place. And so though I'm there on stage, when I can get there and with the other band, even though I'm there, we can communicate, but it's not with words. It's there's another kind of communication that happens, and it doesn't happen all the time, and you can't force it to happen. But when it does, it's so incredible, and everyone, even the audience, they feel it. But we don't know. I don't know what it is.
This reminds me a lot of, our co-director at the Sound Health Network, Charles Lim, has done some really wonderful brain imaging work of jazz improvisers in the moment. And some of his work has shown that in those moments when a person is improvising, their dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the executive regions that Psyche was just kind of talking about, kind of quiet down and let sort of more sensory and other regions of the brain speak or have the stage, as it were. And I think that what you've just described suggests to me that that's kind of maybe the brain mechanism there. Psyche, listening to Regina talk about this, how does that, what do you think about it?
I was looking for the book on flow that Csikszentmihalyi has, and I was like, is it on this shelf?
I think I might have it right up here somewhere too.
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting that you reference mind wandering, right? It's like your mind has gone somewhere else. It's like it's not accessing what's immediately available to you in a sensory way. It's like kind of almost like dreaming or daydreaming, and yet the best of your jam partners are also there, kind of going into that other zone. And of course, we have tools to pick apart, right, those moments when your mind is wandering, usually are accompanied by activity in what's called the default mode network, which includes a few areas that are mainly in the midline and also in the sides of the brain. So medial prefrontal cortex and posterior cingulate cortex, those two areas being active. And they're, as Indre says, they're kind of antagonistic, usually, sort of anti-correlated with the areas of the brain that are important for executive function. And so what some of our colleagues, like Roger Beatty and colleagues, have shown is that when you're engaged in a creative task, you have more of this rapid back and forth, kind of a more of a rapid crosstalk between these areas that are important for mind wandering and these areas that are important for executive function. And so maybe these states of flow kind of come from that rapid crosstalk, and also this kind of maybe perceptually decoupled experience.
You know, I think a lot of people kind of stumble into flow, and then they find the flow, and then they're like, wow, that's my passion. I want to do that again because it's so rewarding intrinsically. But I think Regina, as a professional, as someone who's, whose albums get nominated for Grammy Awards, et cetera, who's like, the stakes are high for you to get into flow more often than others. And I'm sure there are performances in which it just doesn't happen. Maybe there aren't. I mean, that's my assumption, but
yeah.
But, I imagine you're human, in which case there might be some times when that doesn't go. But have you found any techniques that have, that you do, that you use, that you feel like make it more likely that you will be able to get into that state? Are there any like pre-performance things that you do, or is it like when you're practicing or when you're meeting the band for the first time? Do you have any like strategies up your sleeve, or is it a matter of so many years of practice? And
I don't think it's any of any of those. I think it's I call it a spiritual, not an awakening, but a spiritual journey. And you just can't, I can't anyway. I mean, if Psyche, if you know how to tell me how to get there with the brain, I would love to, I'd love to know. But it happens, and I don't know why or when it happens. But some of it too could be if we're all relaxed, or if we're really connected musically, we're on the same space. Sometimes it depends on the audience, what kind of energy we're getting or not getting from them. Because then if it's a certain audience, or I try not to really look at people. But if I do, and like someone's sitting there and they look bored, it doesn't mean they're bored, but in my mind, and so I have to really work to not try to win them over and ignore everyone else. So there's all kinds of things that can come in. People, their phones going off, paper, candies. So there's nothing I can do. It happens. And what's interesting is that whenever those moments seem to happen, if we were recording the set or videotaping, it stopped working. It's like it's not supposed to be recorded. That's kind of
oh, that's so interesting. I'm gonna have to noodle on that for a while.
Yeah, do you feel like having a conversation with your jam partners before, right? Or empathizing with the jam partner? Do you think that puts you into a position of being more likely to then kind of get into that state of flow together?
I think it happens more. Usually I'm with my own band and we're really close. So it happens more so with them than if I'm with a band that I haven't played with before, because I'm not that comfortable, so I'm thinking more, and but if I'm really comfortable, but even talking before, we can play like a week's run, And it might happen one night, it might not, or it'll happen. And when it happens, it's so strong and it's such a good feeling that, of course, the next day I'm trying to like, okay, let me breathe, let me, and I'm trying to get, and you just can't. It's like trying to go to sleep and pick and make that dream, that great dream you had last night, trying to make that happen again and trying to get back to that.
And yet some folks are better at dreaming than others.
Some can even control it in lucid dreaming. But right. I want to talk a little bit about how this might be useful in a clinical setting. So, John, you received a grant from the National Endowment for the Arts called Improving Neurological Functioning in Autistic Children Through Music. And from the project summary, it sounds like the music therapy program that you're evaluating is improvisational. So tell us a little bit about how you came to use improvisation. Is that common in music therapy interventions, and why?
It is common. It just depends on the training that the music therapist has undergone. But there are four main methods that I would say music therapists use. A method would be a music experience, such as improvisation would be one, maybe songwriting would be another. Receptive music therapy, where the client is actively listening to music. You might find that in hospitals during procedures and whatnot. And then there's recreative music experiences, where you might be recreating a song with a client. So it really depends on the client's needs and strengths and challenges. That would determine the type of music experience that would be provided. So primarily I do work improvisationally. And so just to give a context, most of the work that I do and have done is with children and teens, autistics. And our setup is they come into this room with all these different instruments that require no musical skill on the part of the child. So mostly pitched and unpitched percussive instruments. And so a client would walk into the room and start hitting a drum. It's up to the therapist on the piano and or guitar and voice to try to capture what the client is playing and improvise music around it, whereby we're kind of creating a musical portrait of what's going on, meeting their affect, to try to be respectful of what they're playing as well as we can, and be reflexive. So the processes that Regina was talking about when she's playing for an audience, or even in the studio, but I think audience is more connected to what I'm saying, because there's less thinking going on. It's about being reflexive of what we're hearing. So I might pick up on the tempo of what the client is playing on the drum, and then start organizing melody and phrasing that are clinically warranted. So if someone who comes in and has and can sustain beating for a while, and now I can really create an A and a B section and go back to the A. In this sense, I'm using repetition as a way for the client to feel comfortable. They, as you said, with Psyche's research, saying what they can then predict what's going to happen next. We want to create that. However, once they're comfortable and we're engaged, now I want to alter the music a little, maybe change the tempo or change the dynamic. So can the client follow me? If he or she can follow me, that might give you an indication, oh, they're adapting to the changes. That's problem solving in music while sustaining the synchrony. And at the same time, if we even think about what it's like to make music sensorially, there's so many sensory stimuli that's being integrated at the same time, which is sometimes a core feature of autistics. It's a hard time to integrate the sensory input, such as you have your tactile if you're holding sticks, you have the visual input if you're watching, auditory, et cetera, and then they're creating something in the moment. So if I'm altering the tempo, maybe the meter, can they follow? Can they find the pulse if I go to threes or if I go to fours? And then once we have this, we can even try to deepen the experience even more. Because I think my task as the music therapist in doing this is to try to provide an experience for them, for clients, where they can feel a full range of relational experiences with me. And so then if they initiate a musical change, even if it's just a slight change in dynamic with the intent to stay related, now they're showing a glimpse of creativity. And so to now go back into the research grant that we received from the NEA, we wanted to get a better understanding of the mechanisms that are happening neurologically. So we've done a study prior to this grant. We're building on the study that that showed that we can increase engagement by use of imitation. Imitation is a technique in improvisation, but there are different forms of imitating in improvisation. One could be, I'm doing exactly what you're doing. So if you're playing, such as the siren that's happening outside, you hear that fire siren? If I were to imitate that, I would go, wow, I'm copying the intonation, the pitch, the rhythm. I'm in direct synchrony. That would be exact imitation. Then the other thing I can do is imitation with elaboration, where I could imitate certain elements of what you're doing. So if you were, say, non-verbally singing, doesn't mean I have to copy your pitch, but I might pick up on the tempo, the dynamic, and incorporate that on the piano, right? To see if we can increase engagement. And then finally, another form of imitation would be contingent response imitation. Basically what that is, I wait for you to do something, and then I build the theme on it. So it's almost as an improviser, if someone is coming in, if a client comes in and they go in a monotone way, la, 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 then I might come after that, la, da, 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 la, la, la. So forms of imitation. So we found that exact imitation was able to increase engagement with autistic children with who were challenged with language. And so this study was intended to build on that. And we wanted to see if, when we repeat the study, do we get the same outcome again with a different form of imitation through behavioral outcomes? In other words, that study that we just had done a while back was looking at behavioral outcomes, not neurological outcomes. This current study that we're doing under NEA would then look to see if the behavioral outcomes correlate with the neurological EEG outcomes. And so in doing that, we were looking at we want to look at resting state EEG, but we also want to see is if we could tap into the mirror neuron system of the child. And after 12 weeks of treatment, we would play a video, a short video of people playing music and see how that may activate the brain. So basically, the two main things we wanted to see is that if we do a technique of imitation, those three forms of imitation in improvisational music therapy, if we can, I guess, for lack of a better term, alter what's happening neurologically. And we also would be comparing those to neurotypical children that are the same age. But I would say all in all, so I'm a believer that we're more than our brains, and that when I'm delivering the music intervention, I'm thinking of as the client is a musicer too. We're musicking together. It's not an object, it's more of an action. We're not making the music, we're playing music. And so if I can provide this experience to someone who may have a challenging time doing it on their own, this is giving maybe that experience that Regina discusses when when you're on stage, and it's, I don't know, it could be outer body for Regina, it could be a different type of adjective for someone else, but it's that experience of being with someone in an intimate place where you don't need to use words. And I think even in working with autistics or just folks who have a hard time with language, we don't need to use words. We may need to describe what we did, but whose need is that? So we bring these linguistic things to the music experience. But as you said, earlier, it's impossible to describe this thing. And even without that, it's the feeling you get when a session is done. It's a different, it's hard to explain. Luckily, we video record our sessions so we can look back and see what music we might find pertinent and then transcribe it and bring it back into subsequent sessions. But sometimes it is hard to describe, but luckily for video, we can show parents of the kids that we work with, what's going on as opposed to just saying what's happening. And then when we show the video, we can get into more clinical terms. As you know, oh, well, it looks like there's reciprocity happening in music, and there's this social awareness. So because what we do in music, and Psyche could probably speak better to this than me, I don't think it's a vacuum. It's not like there's a music part of the brain. If I'm interacting with you in a communicative way musically, wouldn't that mean that we're also touching on emotional pieces of the brain and cortex pieces if we're moving with intent and with affect to be with another person? So I just think this is great that all, as both of you were chatting, you know, I'm like, wow, because I want to take notes and connect everything, but it's so disconnected. It's just creating music and then studying what's going on neurologically. Understanding the mechanisms, I guess, are important for science. But I think music therapy can be looked at as an art and how we deal with the process of engaging folks in music. But then the science part becomes clinical and research, as Psyche was sharing with us. So, yeah.
Regina, I wonder if you could comment a little bit on sort of what you either have experienced or you hope your audience takes away. Because I know that in the moment when you go to a live performance, you know, it really can be transformative. It really can feel like healing. And I certainly walk away often feeling a lot better, feeling a lot clearer, feeling more connected to the world and you know, to others, and just things seem better. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about sort of that side of things and maybe some of the things that you either observed or you hope your audience comes away with can inform some of the ways in which John might look for how his therapy might be effective.
Well, if I may, I just wanted to jump on something that John, it was interesting when you said with your clients, you come in and maybe if they're playing a rhythmic instrument or something, and you improvise around them, you play around them, which like really, it's like, wow, it's like a light went off, because a lot of times in academia, we do the opposite. We try to say, no, it's not that way, it's this way, and that's so against what I think creativity really is. So thank you for that. I have to remember that. But I do this thing sometimes with my students that have not improvised musically before. And when they come in, it's so I play, but I sing at the same time, and I'll pick any crazy notes. So, and I'll say, hi, my name is Regina. What's your name? And they have to answer me playing and singing. And they all laugh because they're so embarrassed, and they were like, oh, it sounds crazy, but it puts us all on an even playing field. And then then they stop thinking. I think a lot of times in music, and that's the thing, it's when I go to that space, I'm not thinking, or I'm not aware that I'm thinking, that I let go of the thinking part. So as far Andrea, as far as the audience, my hope is that they will feel good, that they can leave whatever was going on outside. They can leave and feel uplifted, and feel good. And of course, I know I can't control what the audience feels. But if it's some kind of experience, at least if they have an experience, that's important. You know, I've had people say to me that, you know, maybe they're going through something, they're going through chemo. I had a woman come to me and say, you know, that piece you played really, really spoke to me, and it was helpful, which is beautiful to me. And I know it's not me, the music comes through me, but that's really beautiful, because then, you know, we've all heard, oh, music is really powerful. And after a while, it sounds so cliche. Oh, music is healing me. But it really can be. And when you see up close and personal what it can do, whether it's to an audience member or someone in the hospital or hospice or wherever, you see that it's a huge gift. So I know I can't control it, but in the end, what I want is for people to feel good.
And I'm sure you accomplish that over and over and over again. Psyche, I wonder if you might tell us a little bit more about this relationship between improvisational music making and language. You mentioned that at the very top, that as we're conversing, we are doing a form of jamming, of improvising. And of course, there are lots of overlaps between the parts, the networks in the brain that are involved in language and in music making, but there are also distinct areas and distinct, ways in which the brain supports those two different functions. Listening to John talk about, especially these kinds of interventions and people who are nonverbal or less verbal, or who have, challenges in a typical language environment, I wonder if you might have something to add about, improvisation in particular as a musical tool to try to help, these individuals either develop those regions or like, what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, lots to say about that. I think, there's so many important components to this improvisatory therapy that John's describing. And I think a big part of it is predictions, right? Shared predictions, the idea that you know where they're going rhythmically, harmonically, and you're kind of playing around it. And that is rewarding, right? That's intrinsically rewarding for the other player to see that you're sharing that specific prediction. And we know that the dopaminergic system in the brain is very much tied to prediction and reward, right? So you get these dopamine bursts of the dopaminergic system when events that you predict actually happen. You also get them when the outcome, when events are better than you predicted. So I think that's those are the areas that are active when we're hearing music that we love the most, right? So for me, I have a few pieces that quite reliably give me the chills when I listen to them. One of the Rachmaninoff piano concertos is one of them. But there's this chord progression that happens and I'm just like, always get the chills. So that's been tied to activity in the dopaminergic system. And so because of that, there's been a party line within the music neuroscience community for a while that music activates the same areas that sex, drugs, and rock and roll all activate the same areas. But it turns out that it's a little bit more than that, because music also activates the medial prefrontal cortex, right? The same areas that are important in mind wandering, that are also important for understanding other people. And that's more, that area is engaged more in music than in, let's say, gambling, right, or food. So there's something about understanding the other person's mind or sharing minds with someone else that I think is what's really beautiful about music. And I think improv really gets at that, because it lets you actively make connection with that shared prediction, right? If you're actually making the prediction and generating the reward, it's much more of an intrinsically motivating, way to get those brain areas talking to each other. And there's another really beautiful study that I'll just briefly touch on, but it looks at the development of trust between two people. So you can think about these, there are these economic games where I'm like, oh, well, there's $10, how will you divide the money? And if you're a generous person, then you let the other person have more money than yourself, right? And if you're a selfish person, then you hog the money for yourself. And you play this game with the partner over and over again. And after a while, you know who you're playing with. So you're playing with, if you know that you're playing with a generous person, then it turns out your reward system tends to be active even before they reward you, right? So the evolution of trust, learning to trust someone, is tied to that same system that's important for understanding other minds, and that's important for reward. So, and I think maybe that's what improv gets at as well, kind of learning to trust other people through reading their minds.
I mean, I can imagine this would be particularly effective or important in autistic individuals who, some of them at least have trouble navigating social interactions because they can't predict what other people might do the way a neurotypical person might. John, I wonder if you could speak to that aspect of your therapy, whether you feel that, like, when a autistic individual suddenly feels both heard and felt and connected because that there are these shared predictions. Does that resonate with your experience?
Absolutely. And it's so connected to music because we use repetition. And we want, and a lot of times kids have great memories, auditory memory skills. So, when I'm improvising something around with what someone's playing, I'm cognizant of creating a melodic theme or a clinical theme that I'm going to repeat. So when the next time comes around, I want to see, can they predict it? Do they understand it? Some kids might have a harder time understanding or processing the way I'm delivering it. So then I'll alter the elements, maybe make it more staccato, put periods and commas in the music, so to speak, or maybe challenge them where it's a little bit more legato. If we see that they can see the turnaround, they understand where it's coming, then we can go to a B section, And what that does is try to take them away from the familiar so that maybe they can be more spontaneous in a way. And then what happens with what's great with live music is say, oh, we're losing the engagement with this B section. I could just go back to the A section. I always equate this to Coltrane's My Favorite Things, where he has this simple melody that everybody knows, right? And he introduces this melody. He does this for 20 minutes, okay? And he then leaves it, but he knows when the listener needs a little taste or elements of that familiar melody to then expand your ear, and your experience of the music. And I think, at least for me, in my experiences as a music therapist, when I'm improvising clinically, I kind of think about that. It's how far away from home can we go and learn independence and still be connected and feel trust, with the therapist? Because I think it's not just the music; it's the music that's being played by a person too. Because let's say someone else comes in and plays the same music, we're not going to get the same outcomes because we have a history and there's a certain type of relationship that's happening, when we are, connected in a specific musical experience. So, but I think the repetition and predictability is so important. And even in everyday life, right? Kind of like what we're doing now. Now we're getting comfortable and things are now familiar. And now the ideas are kind of rolling a little, as opposed to what am I going to talk about?
Yeah, and I think that what you're describing, being able to get back to that A section at some point is the few times when I've seen a jazz improvisational group like the train going off the tracks is when they can't find their way back, when it's not clear, how do you get that train back on the tracks? We have a few questions coming in, and Regina, I wanted to address this one to you from Sarah, which is, I think, related to what we've been talking about, is how you learn this technique. She says that she was trained classically and then had to unlearn a decent amount of that training to learn improv during music therapy training. Sounds like she's training to be a music therapist or is a music therapist already. And she asks, whether there is an unlearning that has to take place when transitioning from classical to improv. And so, Regina, I wondered if you had this experience with your students, since, you probably teach classical students. What's your experience? Do they need to learn something new, or do they need to also unlearn something that is very much ingrained in how they play?
Yeah, I don't like the word unlearn. Just maybe to alter. I think it's a more positive word. There are things that as a European classical player, the first thing that we want to do when we're a young player is the vibrato, so that on the string, and it's used a lot. Actually, it was intended to be an effect. And so I try to get my students, when they're improvising, which is that vibrato just happens. So it takes a lot. Sometimes I'll just have to touch their hand, or to try this. So that's something that they have to that they can alter, because whether you use it, how you use it, that's one thing. The bowing is altered, because in European classical, we're taught, and then it comes, and in jazz, especially bebop or swing, you have to use about that much bow, and a lot of the lines and things we're playing are not necessarily violinistic, so we just got to kind of get in there. So I tell my students, you're learning a new language. You've been speaking English, if that's your mother tongue, for all these years, and now you've been dropped into this class, and we're speaking a different language. And a lot of times we feel like we should just be able to get this because we've been playing for this many years, and it's like, no, but now you're learning a new language, and it's going to take a while, and you have to immerse yourself in it. It doesn't just happen overnight. And with improvisation, sometimes there was a famous string quartet, which I won't mention, and the head of the quartet, I was in a class with him, and he says, well, it's like, my son was at home just playing loud on his instrument. And I was like, oh, it sounds like, that's what jazz musicians do. They just make a bunch of noise. And I was like really offended. And I was like, wow, okay, let's dispel that myth. But yeah, it's difficult. You have to have a lot of patience because you're learning a new language. And that's what I just keep trying to tell my students. You're learning a new language. So you just have to be patient.
Yeah, I mean, that really resonates. I'm a soprano who was trained in the European classical tradition. And so vibrato is just considered a part of the healthy tone of singing. And of course, it's like, opera singing is probably one of the only vocal techniques in which vibrato is a constant force. Everywhere else, it's used for effect. And so that's something that I think a lot of opera singers who are trained in that way really struggle with if they are asked to, or if they choose to, to pull the vibrato off without actually hurting the way they're singing. I have another question from David, and I think I'd like to address this one to Psyche. He's commenting on the fact that this resonates with me as someone who was trained in the European classical tradition, that interpreting a piece also has a kind of improvisational quality in the moment. So like, certainly, when you're singing, you don't feel like you're a robot and you're just like rehashing something you've memorized. It does feel as if you're creating in the moment. And of course, that's very different though from creating not just, the interpretation, but also the melody and all of the other aspects of what you're doing. So I wondered if you have looked at, or if anyone's looked at this difference between, a classical musician who's playing something from memory, trying to recreate perhaps, something that they've played before, or not thinking so much about what is the novel interpretation, versus someone who is, actually in the moment trying to, sing as if or play as if no one's ever done it exactly that way before. Has anyone looked at that? Or is it too niche specific still?
I think that is relatively specific, but I know that there's been some psychophysical studies done on articulation and on timbre, right? So I would say that, certainly a classical interpretation is still, even though there are some aspects that are very fixed, there are still many decisions, variables that you can choose. And I think, so I would think about even the motor control, the line of work from motor control, where I think it's Daniela Samler, this is a group in Germany, that had looked at the hand shapes that you use to make chord progressions on the piano. So you can think about how some hand shapes are kind of harder to accomplish, to use to play certain chord progressions. And when a classical musician looks at that, they think more, their brain responses are more in line with the way the hands have to be to, like, motorically to execute that chord progression. Whereas when a jazz musician looks at that chord progression, they're thinking more functionally in terms of harmony. So I would say that the interpretation is often tied to the motor constraints that you bring to bear to make it happen. And I would say there are many levels of decisions that are being made at like either moment by moment basis, and also between different practice sessions where you kind of ruminate on what just happened in the last practice sessions, and so you then make certain decisions and changes in the next iteration. And that's, I would say that's probably as much classical as it is jazz, or it is any kind of musical training, is as much in between the sessions as during the sessions.
And this highlights, Regina, what you were just talking about, that conversation with that person from the string quartet about this kind of myth that if you're improvising, you don't need to have the same level of skill on the instrument. But in fact, I think, at least I would imagine that the great improvisers would have to have just as, if not more, skill on their instrument, because not only do they have to have it do what they want it to do in the moment? They don't have time to practice that particular thing 15 times before they get it right and can take it, onto the stage. And that sort of brings me to a question from Cheryl, who is an improvising cellist. And I'm assuming it's a she, but they are talking about the difference between free improv and jazz improv. And I wondered if you could illuminate me, at least, because I don't really, I can guess what the difference is, but I don't really understand what the difference is, and maybe how that relates to kind of the skill that a person has to have on an instrument to be able to do either of those.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because when we talk about improvisation, and we're talking about jazz improvisation right now, but there's improvisation in so many different styles of music, and it's always interesting for me to meet people like the Irish fiddlers or the folk fiddlers, and how they that's their mother tongue on their instrument. So they may not have all the skills of, say, like an Itzhak Perlman, but they have the skills needed for what they do, and they can move. And in the end, I try to tell my students, you don't have to, because we always think, okay, here comes the chords, let me play all these notes. And I'm like, no, play one note and make me feel something, so what are you going to do with that? What are you going to do with the space? What are you going to do with your bowing? Like, get really creative. So a lot of times with standard, I guess, jazz or bebop and swing, you have your chord changes, and it's based on those chord changes when you're improvising. And with free jazz, at least my experience with it, you might have a sound that you're using, or it might be an idea. It's a collective idea. Maybe it's that the composer has written a piece, and it depends on, I've done works by Wadada Leo Smith, where it's almost like a math geometry thing, and you have to alter techniques where you're putting maybe paper clip in the strings and you're creating other sounds. So it's like approaching the instrument as if it's not, you don't know what this is. You found this thing. It's not a violin. It's not a cello. It's not and not having the expectations. But I think almost in free improvisation, you have to really pay attention more to each other, because you don't necessarily have that, the form or the, so it's really about really coming outside of your own head and really listening to the other person and having a conversation and seeing where that conversation goes. And if it's based off of a melody that someone has composed, that's one thing. If it's not, if it's completely just improvised at that point, it's still, I feel like you really have to be engaged.
Oh, that's really interesting, because one of the things that Cheryl says she uses free improv for is to find safety in social connection. And from what you're saying, it sounds like you need to have a much deeper social connection potentially in a free jazz setting compared with a standard jazz setting. Yeah.
Yeah, that reminds me of another really interesting study that looked at pairwise, like dyadic improvisations, where I think it was coming out of France, the IRCAM, very experimental tradition, where they gave pairs of performers words like affiliative or cooperative or antagonistic, and they had to play cooperative or affiliative or antagonistic. And then afterwards, and they made these recordings of the performances, and independent groups of listeners could very well tell just by listening to the recording what they were trying to convey.
Oh, interesting.
But what they could not tell by just one track. They needed both tracks to be able to tell. So it was an emergent property of what the two players were doing together.
Oh, that's really interesting.
I think that's a very free jazz. That's a much more like free jazz kind of setting.
John, I was wondering if you might comment on the choice of, I understand practically why you would choose instruments that don't require any training to present to your clients. But I also wonder about, the idea of like giving them access to an instrument that does require training, but still makes lots of sounds. Like, like what if you gave them access to a piano or guitar, or, even a violin, hopefully wouldn't get damaged. I know they're fragile instruments, but maybe a marimba or, something that like.
Yeah, no, we do. Like, so usually the music therapist is on the piano, on the harmonic instrument. But if the client wants to come and play on those instruments, it's perfectly fine. And we'll find, it could be a wide range of how they play. It could be just clusters. And then whatever he or she is playing, it's our job to create music around it so it's communicative. Because we're looking at everything as communication. Even the guitar, they want to, maybe they like the way the strings look or the way they line up, and so they're hitting the strings. I'll try to be the person, fretting the chords. Even on the piano, I try to get on the low end if possible, because for obvious reasons, because it'd be hard. It's hard that the sound will cut through on the high end if they're really chomping away on those low keys. So those they're welcome to play them, and we do have like xylembas and metallophones that they're melodic instruments, but whatever is played, we can make it sound relational. And we hope that the client, because once they play in an isolated way, whatever it is, once we play together, now we're connected. It's not isolated, or it's not what people might say, oh, he's perseverating on the instrument. Once we can get in there with them, whether it's on the piano or the guitar, we try to make it relational. So that's a great question. I should have mentioned that it's there for them to play, but we try to kind of harness the affect and the musical connection, if you will.
Well, we just have a couple minutes left, and I wondered if there were any questions that any of you had for each other that you haven't had a chance to ask for, even if it's not directly related to what we're talking about.
Yeah, Regina, when you're talking about free jazz and how you're really listening, I always thought about like the music is there, it's there, and sometimes you would think about that we just have to get out of the way, because the more we're thinking about the technique or the right notes, Victor Wooten, who's this great bassist. He talks about, we focus too much on notes. And by the time you're improvising, trying to find notes, you're already a measure behind. And I'm just wondering, what do you think about that? Does that connect with what you mentioned about free jazz?
Well, I just think not even just in free jazz, just in improvisation, period. We're, I feel like a lot of times, even learning to improvise, especially in the jazz setting, so many times in the universities and colleges, they're taught, okay, here's this chord, and with this chord, you could play this scale, or you could play that scale, and there's students that can learn all of that, but they're still not making music. They're not making people feel things. And that's not the way this music was originally learned. People would sit around and go out and hear live music, or they'd buy a record, or if they were in countries where they weren't allowed to listen to jazz, they'd sneak and get that jazz record and hear that and learn it and play together. So it's a community activity, but I feel I great bassist and composer John Clayton. Even when we were in a recording session once, and he told us, he said, when you do this next take, really listen to everybody else, just overly listen. And what it did, it forced us out of our own heads. And instead of us being in there trying to play all our stuff and play the hippest thing and blah, 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 right. We made music together then. You could really hear the conversation.
Well, I think that's the right place to end, to remind people that listening is just as effective as any other tool we have in our tool belt. And that's one of our goals here at the Sound Health Network, is to bring people together from different disciplines and listen to each other. So Regina, John, and Psyche, thank you so much for coming onto this webinar and for sharing your insights.
Thank you for having me. It's been fun.
Yeah, this was great. Can we stay on?
Well, it's not over yet. Our next webinar will be March 30th, and we'll talk about how music therapy might be used to help people with sickle cell disease and other painful conditions. And right now, you can join me and everyone else, if they so choose, on our virtual platform. We're going to be chatting with Daniel Harvey, who's an artistic and community manager at Opera Parallel. It's an opera company here in San Francisco. And they are premiering a opera by Lembit Beecher called Sophia's Forest this weekend. And it's a story of a young girl who wrestles with the trauma of being a refugee by immersing herself in her imagination. So if you want to have a preview of that, and we'll also be sort of telling you a little bit more about the opera, you can join us at soundhealth.vfairs.com. That's V as in Victor, FAIRS. We'll meet there in just a minute. And otherwise, to learn more about the Sound Health Network and to take advantage of the resources we offer, including a clearinghouse of research publications on this and many other topics related to sound health, visit our website at soundhealth.ucsf.edu. And you can engage with us through our social media accounts at Sound Health Net on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And of course, watch this and other archived video content on our YouTube channel. See you soon. Thank you all so much. And I look forward to continuing the conversation.
Thank you.